Keep your head down and keep moving. That was Zara's mantra. At 19, the red pizzeria uniform felt less like clothes and more like an invisibility cloak. As she cycled through the rain-slicked streets of the Iron District, her thermal bag weighed heavy with a $40 order for a man who wouldn't even look her in the eye. The clock on her phone read 11:47 p.m. Rain tapped against her jacket in a steady, indifferent rhythm. Somewhere above her, a television flickered behind Venetian blinds, someone else's life warm and contained. Zara didn't have a life like that. She had this. The road, the cold, the delivery. She turned onto Callahan Street, a narrow corridor of shuttered storefronts and dripping awnings, and that's when the night changed. Pop, pop, pop. The sound wasn't fireworks. It was the mechanical cough of a suppressed weapon, sharp, deliberate, and swallowed almost immediately by the rain. A sleek black sedan roared past her without headlights, its engine growling low like something predatory. It disappeared around the corner before Zara could even register what she'd seen. Then she looked down. A young boy, no older than 12, lay crumpled on the sidewalk like a marionette with its strings cut. His school jacket, navy blue, a patch on the sleeve that read Hanguk Academy, was spreading a dark stain across the chest. His eyes were open, fluttering. His small hands reached up toward the streetlight as though trying to grab the rain itself. Zara's bike skidded to a stop, so hard the front tire locked and screamed against the wet concrete. Hey, don't go over there. Marcus Lee stood under the awning of a closed tailor shop, his overcoat pulled tight against the drizzle like armor. He was a businessman, the kind who wore watches that cost more than Zara's rent. His phone was already in his hand, camera on, pointed at the boy. "You're just the pizza girl," Marcus said, his voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who had never been in real danger. "Call the cops and run. You'll get us all killed." Zara didn't hear him, not fully. Marcus's voice had become something distant, a radio playing in another room, because she was looking at the boy's hands. The way they curled and uncurled, grasping at nothing. The way his mouth moved, trying to form a word he didn't have the breath for. He looked exactly like her brother had. 5 years ago, a different street, a different city, the same helpless, reaching hands. The air turned electric. Zara didn't run. She unbuckled her thermal pizza bag, the one thing between her and the cold, and sprinted toward the boy, her braids whipping behind her like dark ribbons in the wind. The boy's blood was warm when it touched her hands. That was the detail Zara would remember longest. Not the sound of the gunshots, not the roar of the sedan, but the warmth. It was the only warm thing on that street. Everything else, the concrete, the rain, the air itself, felt like it belonged to a world that had already decided this boy was dead. She dropped to her knees beside him and pressed the thermal bag flat against his chest. The insulated lining, designed to keep a pepperoni pizza hot for 40 minutes, now served a single, desperate purpose: pressure. She pushed down with both hands, feeling the give beneath the fabric, the slow, wet pulse of something she refused to name. "Stay with me," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Hey, look at me, stay with me." The boy's eyes drifted. They were dark, almost black in the streetlight, and filled with a confusion that had nothing to do with pain. It was the confusion of someone whose entire world had just been rearranged without warning. Behind her, Marcus hadn't moved. His phone light illuminated the scene in a blue-white wash, and she could hear the faint click of his camera adjusting focus. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Marcus muttered, more to his phone than to her. "Some delivery girl playing doctor in the middle of the street. Someone's going to want to see this." Zara didn't turn around. She tore a napkin from the small stack in her jacket pocket, the kind pizza shops printed their logo on, and folded it into a tight square. She slid it beneath the thermal bag, directly over the wound, and pressed again, harder this time. The boy flinched. A small, involuntary sound escaped his lips, not quite a word, not quite a cry, but it was something. It meant he was still there. "I know," Zara whispered. "I know it hurts, but you have to stay awake for me. Can you do that?" A flutter of eyelids, the faintest nod. Zara exhaled. It wasn't relief, not yet. It was something closer to determination. The kind that sits in the chest like a coal, quiet and burning. She kept one hand on the pressure point and used the other to scan the street. The sedan was gone. The rain kept falling. And somewhere in the silence between raindrops, she could swear she heard an engine idling far away, but patient. The engine sound didn't go away. Zara lifted her head, rain streaking down her face, and scanned both ends of Callahan Street. The road was empty, but the kind of empty that felt rehearsed, like the street itself was holding its breath. Then she saw it, a reflection in a puddle 20 feet ahead, two white headlights, barely visible, moving slowly at the far end of the block. The black sedan. It had looped around. They were coming back. "Oh no," Zara breathed. She looked down at the boy. His breathing had gone shallow, a thin, reedy sound that barely moved his chest. The thermal bag was soaked through now, dark and heavy in her hands. She'd bought herself maybe 3 minutes, maybe less. Marcus, still standing under his awning, finally lowered his phone. "That's your cue, pizza girl," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't just fear, it was relief. Relief that someone else was closer to the danger than him. "Whatever this kid got into, it's not your fight. Walk away, now." Zara looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. He was a tall man, well-dressed, with the kind of face that belonged on a billboard. But his eyes were the eyes of someone who had spent his entire life making sure other people were the ones standing in the line of fire. She turned back to the boy. "Can you hold on?" she asked, already hooking her arms beneath him. "I need you to hold on." The boy's hand, small, cold, trembling, reached up and gripped the collar of her jacket. It wasn't much, but it was an answer. Zara lifted him. He weighed almost nothing, lighter than her thermal bag had been full of pizzas, and the wrongness of that hit her somewhere deep, in a place she'd spent years trying to wall off. She adjusted him against her chest, one arm locked beneath his knees, the other braced behind his back, and she ran. Not toward the main road. Not toward the noise or the light or the places where people pretended to feel safe. She ran toward the dark. At the end of Callahan Street, half hidden by a dumpster and a broken fire escape, there was a service entrance, a narrow metal door set into the side of a restaurant called Golden Lotus. It had been closed for 2 months. Zara knew this because she'd tried to deliver there 3 times before someone finally took the listing down. She shifted the boy to one arm, grabbed the door handle, and pulled. It opened with a groan of rust and disuse. The darkness inside swallowed them whole. Behind her, the headlights turned the corner. The basement smelled like old grease and mildew, and something sweet that had gone sour a long time ago. Zara set the boy down on the concrete floor as gently as she could manage, which wasn't very gently at all. Every second counted, and gentleness was a luxury she couldn't afford. She pulled out her phone, switched on the flashlight, and wedged it between 2 stacked crates so it cast a pale cone of light across the space. The boy's eyes were closed now. His breathing had changed, slower, more irregular, with a faint rattling sound that made Zara's stomach drop. "Hey," she said sharply, tapping his cheek. "No, stay here, open your eyes." "Nothing." She tapped again, harder. "Open your eyes." A flutter. Then slowly those dark eyes opened, glassy and unfocused, but open. Zara moved fast. She scanned the basement with a kind of practiced eye that came from years of navigating cramped kitchens and cluttered back rooms. Shelving units lined the walls, half empty. A broken mop bucket. A stack of takeout containers. And there, a plastic straw, still in its paper sleeve, sitting in a tray of old supplies near what had once been a prep station. She grabbed it and knelt back down beside the boy. His breathing was the problem. She could hear it now. The wet, gurgling quality that meant fluid was gathering somewhere it shouldn't be, if his airway closed. Everything else stopped mattering. "I need you to open your mouth for me," Zara said, keeping her voice low and even. The same voice she used to calm stray dogs in the alleys behind her apartment building. "Can you do that? Just open your mouth." The boy's lips parted. Zara tilted his head back carefully, positioning his chin upward, and slid the plastic straw past his lips. It wasn't a surgical airway. It wasn't even close. But it was a channel, a narrow, stubborn channel, and sometimes that was enough. The rattling sound eased, just slightly, but it eased. Zara let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Then the boy's hand found hers again. His fingers were ice cold and shaking, and they wrapped around two of her fingers with a grip that was surprisingly firm for someone losing blood in a basement. "What's your name?" Zara asked, because she needed him conscious. Because talking was the best way to keep someone tethered to the world. The boy's lips moved around the straw. It took effort. She could see it in the way his jaw clenched, the way his brow furrowed like he was solving a difficult equation. A breath. Min-Jun. Min-Jun, Zara repeated, and something in her chest tightened. A name. He was a name now, not just a body on a sidewalk. "That's a good name. I'm Zara, and I need you to keep talking to me. Min-Jun, can you do that?" Another nod, smaller this time. And then, so quietly that Zara almost missed it beneath the sound of the rain drumming against the metal door above them, Min-Jun whispered something that changed everything. Don't let them tell my father." Zara froze. She looked at the boy, really looked at him. The school jacket, the academy patch, the way he'd said "my father" with a weight that didn't belong in a 12-year-old's voice. It was the weight of someone who understood, even now, even bleeding on a basement floor, exactly what his name meant. "Who is your father?" Zara asked. Min-Jun's eyes found hers. They were clearer now, sharper, as though the question had pulled him back from the edge. He didn't answer, but he didn't have to. Footsteps. Zara heard them before she saw anything, heavy, deliberate, and multiplied. At least 3 sets, moving along the alley outside. They weren't rushed. They weren't searching. They moved with the unhurried confidence of people who already knew where they were going. She killed the phone flashlight instantly. Darkness swallowed them. Min-Jun made a small sound, a whimper, barely audible, and Zara pressed her finger gently against his lips. Not to silence him, to remind him she was there. She listened. The footsteps stopped directly outside the service entrance. A flashlight beam cut through the gap beneath the metal door, a thin, sweeping line of white that crawled across the basement floor like a searching finger. "Check inside," a voice said. Male, flat, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who gave instructions the way other people breathed automatically, without thinking. Zara's mind raced. The door was 15 feet away. If they opened it, the flashlight would find them in seconds. The basement was open, no walls, no dividers, nothing to hide behind except the shelving units, and those were skeletal at best. Then she looked up. Above her, running along the ceiling in a line of rusted metal, was a ventilation crawlspace. She'd seen it before, weeks ago, on a delivery run to a restaurant 2 doors down. The vents in this whole block were connected, a shared system built decades ago when the buildings were constructed as one structure. Zara had memorized the layout without meaning to. It was a habit, cataloging exits, mapping spaces, knowing where the doors were before you needed them. The habit of someone who had learned, young, that the world was not always safe. The crawlspace access panel was directly above the prep station, 4 feet up. Zara could reach it if she stood on the crate beneath it. She looked at Min-Jun. He was watching her in the dark. She could feel his eyes even if she couldn't see them, and his grip on her fingers tightened. "I need to pick you up again," she whispered, so close to his ear that the words were barely breath. "And I need you to be very, very quiet. No matter what, can you do that for me?" A squeeze of her fingers. Yes. Zara moved. She scooped Min-Jun up in one fluid motion, cradling him against her chest the way she had on the street, and crossed the basement in silence. Every footstep was placed with care, avoiding the loose gravel near the drains, skirting the edge of the broken mop bucket. She'd spent her whole life learning how to move through spaces without being seen. The red uniform had never been an invisibility cloak after all. This was. She climbed the crate one-handed, reached up, and pushed the access panel. It swung open with a creak that sounded, in the silence, like a gunshot. The footsteps outside stopped. Zara didn't hesitate. She pulled herself up into the crawl space, Min-Jun pressed against her, and slid the panel shut behind her just as the basement door groaned open below. Light flooded the space beneath her. She could see it through the thin gaps in the ventilation grate, 3 men in dark jackets, scanning the basement with military precision. One of them was holding something long and black beneath his coat. A weapon. Real, not suppressed this time. "Nothing here," the man with the flat voice said after a long silence. "The blood trail ends at the door," another one said. He was crouched near the entrance, pointing a penlight at the concrete. "Someone carried him in, but there's nothing inside." A pause. Zara held her breath. Min-Jun's face was pressed against her neck, and she could feel his heartbeat, fast, rabbit-quick, but steady. "Expand the search," the flat voice said. 3 blocks, and find out who else was on that street tonight." They left, the door closed. The basement went dark again. Zara didn't move for a full minute after the last footstep faded. Then she exhaled, long, shaking, silent, and allowed herself, for just a moment, to tremble. The crawl space was tight, barely enough room to lie flat, and it smelled like dust and old metal and something faintly electrical, like a wire that had been carrying current for too long. Zara lay on her back with Min-Jun curled against her side, his head resting on her arm, the plastic straw still loosely in place between his lips. His breathing had stabilized. Slower now, more even, but the blood loss was real, and Zara knew from years of watching medical shows during the rare nights she could afford to sit still, that stabilization wasn't the same as safety. It was a pause, a reprieve, the body buying time it might not have enough of. She needed to keep him warm, she needed to keep him conscious, and she needed to figure out what she had gotten herself into. It was Min-Jun who answered that last question, though he didn't mean to. While Zara was adjusting his position, trying to elevate his legs slightly by propping them on a vent bracket, her hand brushed something beneath the collar of his school jacket. A chain, thin and silver, disappearing into the fabric. She followed it with her fingertips and found a pendant, small and flat, resting against his sternum just above the wound. She pulled it free gently and held it up to the faint light that crept through the grating above them. It was a medallion, not costume jewelry. The metal was heavy, well-made, with a weight that spoke of real craftsmanship. The design on its face was a stylized tiger mid-leap, rendered in sharp, angular lines. Beneath it, etched in small, precise Korean characters, was a name. Zara couldn't read Korean, but she didn't need to. She had seen this symbol before. On a delivery box, months ago, a high-end order to an address in the Highgate district that had made her nervous in ways she couldn't articulate. On a placard in the window of a dry cleaner's that never seemed to have any customers. On the side of a black car that had idled outside her apartment building for 3 days straight last winter before disappearing without explanation. The tiger, the Iron Tiger. The Park Syndicate. Zara's hand closed around the medallion, and the warmth of it, body heat, Min-Jun's body heat, fatting but still present, felt suddenly like holding something fragile and explosive at the same time. "Min-Jun," she said quietly. "Min-Jun, look at me." The boy's eyes opened. They were dimmer now, the glassiness returning, but they found her face. "This pendant," Zara said, holding it up so he could see. "This is yours." A slow blink. "Yes." Zara stared at the medallion for a long moment. The tiger stared back, mid-leap, frozen in metal, going nowhere and everywhere at once. She wasn't just holding a boy anymore. She was holding the heir to one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the city. The only son of a man whose name was spoken in whispers even by people who had no reason to fear him. A man whose reach extended into police departments, city halls, and boardrooms alike. And somewhere out there, that man was about to learn his son had been shot. Zara tucked the pendant back beneath Min-Jun's collar, carefully, and pulled him closer. "Okay," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Okay." The word felt like stepping off a cliff. She heard the sirens first. Not the distant, ambient sirens that were a constant undercurrent in the Iron District, the background noise of a city that wore its violence openly. These were close, deliberate, and they weren't alone. Through the crawlspace grating, Zara could see a sliver of the street below. The view was narrow, maybe a foot wide, but it was enough. Black SUVs. 4 of them, pulling up to the curb with the kind of coordinated precision that no civilian convoy could achieve. Their headlights cut through the rain like searchlights, and men were moving before the vehicles had fully stopped, emerging from doorways, from shadows, from positions Zara hadn't even known were occupied. This wasn't a search party. This was a deployment. And then he stepped out. Min-Jun Park emerged from the second SUV, and the street seemed to contract around him. He was not a large man, average height, lean, dressed in a dark wool coat that was tailored so precisely it looked almost architectural. His hair was silver at the temples, swept back from a face that could have been carved from pale stone. He moved without hurry, without urgency, and that was what made him terrifying. The world was burning, and he walked through it like he owned the fire. His eyes swept the street. Once, slowly, the way a predator scans open ground, not searching, exactly, cataloging. Zara watched from above, her heart beating so hard she was sure Min-Jun could feel it. "Find him," Junho said. 2 words, spoken at a volume that should have been swallowed by the rain. But every man on that street heard them, and every man on that street moved. Marcus Lee was still there. Of course he was. He'd retreated further under his awning, but he hadn't left, couldn't leave, Zara realized, because the SUVs had sealed off both ends of the block. He was trapped, and he knew it, and his face had gone the color of wet cement. One of Junho's men approached Marcus. The conversation was brief. Marcus pointed, down the street, toward Golden Lotus, toward the service entrance where the blood trail ended. Zara couldn't hear what he said, but she could see the shape of it in his body language, the eager, desperate way he gestured, the way he leaned forward as though offering himself up as useful. Junho didn't look at Marcus. His gaze had drifted to the basement door, still slightly ajar from when his own men had entered and exited earlier. He stared at it for a long moment, perfectly still, and something moved behind his eyes. Something that wasn't anger exactly. It was colder than anger. It was the expression of a man doing math, calculating odds, weighing outcomes, preparing for every possible version of what came next. Min-Jun shifted against Zara's side. His hand found her jacket again, gripping weakly. "Papa!" The word was barely a breath, not loud enough to reach the street below, not loud enough to reach anyone but Zara. But she felt it land in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She wrapped her arm tighter around him and pressed her lips close to his ear. "I know," she whispered. "I know he's here, but I need a little more time, just a little more. Can you give me that?" Min-Jun's grip tightened. His eyes, still glassy, still fatting, found hers in the dark, and in them Zara saw something she hadn't expected. Trust. Not the blind trust of a frightened child. Something quieter, something earned. Below them, Min-Jun Park turned toward Golden Lotus and began to walk. The basement door opened again, and this time the light that flooded in was different. Brighter, steadier. Not flashlights, floodlights, the kind mounted on equipment cases, casting the basement in a harsh, shadowless white that left nowhere to hide. Junho didn't enter first. 2 of his men did, moving through the space with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this hundreds of times. They checked the corners, the shelving units, the shadows. They found nothing. The basement was empty. Then one of them looked up. Zara saw him do it, saw the slight tilt of his head, the way his eyes traced the ventilation grating above the prep station. She saw the pause, the recognition, the way his hand moved, almost imperceptibly, toward the weapon beneath his jacket. He didn't draw it. He turned and said one word, in Korean, to the man beside him. Then he stepped back, and Min-Jun Park walked into the basement. The silence that followed was absolute. Junho stood in the center of the room, perfectly still, his silver-templed head tilted slightly upward. He was looking at the grating. He already knew. Zara could see it in the way his jaw set, not with surprise, but with a kind of grim confirmation, as though the universe had simply delivered the information he'd been waiting for. "Come down," he said. His voice was quiet, conversational, almost, but it carried an authority that made the air feel heavier. He wasn't asking. Zara's mind raced. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Min-Jun was pressed against her, trembling now not from cold, but from the proximity of his father's voice, from the recognition of it, from the complex tangle of fear and relief, and something else that Zara couldn't name but could feel radiating off the boy like heat. There was no point in hiding anymore. The men knew where they were. Junho knew where they were. Running was not an option, not in a crawl space, not with a wounded boy, not with a small army between her and the street. Zara moved the access panel open. The light hit her full in the face, blinding after so long in the dark, and she squinted against it, one arm wrapped around Min-Jun, the other bracing herself against the edge of the opening. She dropped down. The landing jarred her knees, and pain shot up through her legs, but she absorbed it silently, straightening to her full height, which wasn't much. But she straightened anyway and looked directly at Junho Park. She must have been a sight. Her red pizzeria jacket was soaked through with blood, Min-Jun's blood, and her braids had come loose, hanging in wet, tangled ropes around her face. Her hands were dark with drying crimson from fingertip to wrist. She looked, she knew, like exactly what Junho's men would have assumed. A threat. An enemy. Someone who had taken his son and was now being cornered. Every weapon in the room was pointed at her. Zara held Min-Jun tighter and met Junho's gaze without flinching. "I didn't hurt him," she said. Her voice was steady, calm, the same voice she'd used on the sidewalk, the same voice that had kept Min-Jun breathing in the dark. "Someone else did. I just made sure he didn't die because of it." Junho's expression didn't change. His eyes, dark, precise, utterly unreadable, moved from Zara's face to Min-Jun, then back again. Slowly, deliberately. Behind Zara, the basement door opened again, and Marcus Lee stepped inside, rain-damp and eager, his phone clutched in one hand like a lifeline. "Mr. Park," Marcus said, his voice carrying the oily smoothness of someone who believed charm could stop a bullet. "I'm the one who called it in. I saw the whole thing. And I can tell you this girl, she's nobody, just a delivery worker. I have it all on video. She was trying to move your son on her own. No ambulance, no police." Junho raised one finger. Marcus stopped mid-sentence, as though someone had pressed pause on a remote. The silence stretched, 1 second, 2, 3. And then Min-Jun spoke. It started as a sound so small that Zara almost missed it. A dry, reedy exhale that could have been a cough, or a sigh, or nothing at all. But then it shaped itself into something unmistakable. "Papa." The word fell into the basement like a single stone, dropped into a well quiet. But the ripple it created moved through everything. Junho's composure cracked. Not visibly, not to anyone who wasn't watching closely. But Zara was watching closely because she was holding his son, and she had spent the last hour reading every flicker of this boy's face like it was the only map she had. She saw it, the way Junho's jaw tightened. The way his hands, hanging at his sides, curled into fists and then released. The way his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, suddenly went wet at the edges before he controlled them. He took one step forward, then stopped. Because Min-Jun wasn't reaching for him. The boy's hand, the one that wasn't gripping Zara's jacket, was extended outward, but it wasn't pointed at his father. It was pointed at Zara, at the woman holding him. The woman covered in his blood, with her braids falling loose and her red jacket ruined and her hands shaking, finally, visibly shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion and the weight of what she'd done. Min-Jun's fingers curled weakly around Zara's wrist. "The others," he said. His voice was thin, threadbare, barely there, but every person in that basement heard it. "The others watched." A pause, Zara's breath caught. Only the pizza girl stayed. The words hung in the air like smoke. Marcus Lee made a small sound, something between a cough and a swallow, and took an involuntary step backward. His phone had gone dark. He wasn't recording anymore. Junho didn't move. He stood exactly where he was, his eyes fixed on his son, and for the first time since he'd entered the basement, the mask slipped. Not all the way Zara suspected it never came all the way off, not for a man like him. But enough. Enough for her to see the father underneath the Syndicate boss. enough to see the fear he'd been carrying since the moment someone told him his only child had been shot. His gaze shifted to Zara, slowly, deliberately, the way it had swept the street earlier, cataloging, calculating, but different now. There was something new in it, something she couldn't quite read but felt the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. It wasn't gratitude, exactly. Gratitude was too simple a word for what passed between them in that moment. It was something closer to recognition. The look of a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from him, loyalty, money, power, protection, and had just encountered, for the first time in longer than he could remember, someone who had given something without expecting anything back. Zara held his gaze and didn't look away. Min-Jun's grip on her wrist tightened, just slightly, and his eyes drifted closed again, not in defeat this time, but in something closer to peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing, finally, that you are safe. Jun-Ho Park exhaled. Then he turned to one of his men and said, in a voice stripped of all pretense, all authority, all performance, "Get a doctor, now." 3 months later, the Iron District looked the same. The rain still fell on Callahan Street. The storefronts were still shuttered, the awnings still dripping, the streetlights still casting their pale, indifferent glow over a neighborhood that the rest of the city preferred to forget. Golden Lotus was still closed. The service entrance where Zara had carried a dying boy into the dark was still rusted, still half hidden by the dumpster, still invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But Zara was not invisible anymore. She pulled up to the curb in a sleek black car, not the kind she drove, but the kind that had been assigned to her, and cut the engine. The leather seat creaked softly as she leaned back, and for a moment she just sat there, watching the street through the rain-streaked windshield the way she used to watch it from the back of her bike. Same view, different world. The apartment building across the street was the one she'd lived in for 3 years, a cramped one-bedroom on the 4th floor with radiators that clanked and a window that faced a brick wall. She'd given up the lease 6 weeks ago. She didn't need it anymore. A figure moved on the sidewalk below, hunched against the drizzle, clutching a clipboard to his chest like a shield. Marcus Lee. He was wearing a gray polo shirt now, the uniform of a mid-level clerk at a shipping company on the east side of town. A company that Zara knew without having to check was owned by the Park family. The assignment had been Jun-Ho's idea. Not punishment, exactly. Something more precise than that. A correction. A rebalancing of the scales. Marcus looked up as the black car idled at the curb. His eyes found Zara through the glass, found the woman in the dark coat, with her braids pulled back neatly, no red uniform in sight, and something flickered across his face. Recognition. Then something else. Something that looked a lot like the fear he'd told her to feel on that rainy night, 3 months ago, when a boy was bleeding on the sidewalk and Marcus Lee had raised his phone and told her to run. Zara didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't acknowledge him at all. She simply held his gaze for one beat, long enough for him to understand, and then looked away. She thought about Min-Jun sometimes in the quiet hours. He was healing. The doctors Jun-Ho had summoned that night, real doctors, the kind who didn't ask questions and didn't file reports, had stabilized him within the hour. The bullet had missed his lung by centimeters. A miracle, they'd called it. Zara didn't believe in miracles. She believed in thermal pizza bags and plastic straws and the stubborn, stupid refusal to let someone die on your watch. Min-Jun was back in school now, Hanguk Academy. He sent her a message sometimes, short, a little formal, the way kids are when they're trying to be brave about something that frightened them. Last week, it had been a photo of a dog he'd seen on his walk home, with no caption. Zara had stared at it for longer than she would admit. The position Jun-Ho had offered her was not a small one. Head of logistics for the Park family meant exactly what it sounded like, and also meant things that it didn't. It meant she sat in rooms where decisions were made that shaped the city. It meant she had access to information that could destroy careers, families, entire networks of power. It meant that for the first time in her life, she was not the person standing in the margins while the world happened around her. She had hesitated when Jun-Ho first made the offer. Not because she was afraid. She'd proven, on a cold sidewalk in the Iron District, that fear wasn't the thing that stopped her. She hesitated because accepting meant entering a world she'd spent her whole life avoiding. A world of power, of consequence, of people who moved through the dark with purpose and precision. But Jun-ho had looked at her, the same way he had in that basement, with that quiet, unreadable recognition, and said something she hadn't expected. You are the only person in this city who has ever done something for my son without wanting something in return. That is not a quality I can afford to waste. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even exactly an offer. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same flat certainty Jun-ho brought to everything. And Zara, who had spent 19 years being told, in one way or another, that she didn't matter, had looked back at him and said yes. Now she sat in the black car on Callahan Street, watching the rain fall on a neighborhood that hadn't changed, and felt the quiet hum of something she'd never had a name for before. It wasn't happiness, not exactly. It was something steadier than that, something that sat in the chest like a coal, quiet and burning, the same way it had on the night she'd knelt beside a bleeding boy and chosen not to run. Zara put the car in drive. The engine hummed. The rain kept falling. She pulled away from the curb, and the street swallowed the sound of her, the way it swallowed everything. But this time, she wasn't disappearing. She was just getting started. And